Hi, I'm Paul Fernandes. I'm at Heriot University at the Lyell Centre. I'm a fisheries scientist, and I'm involved with the FISHSPAMMS project, which I'll talk about now with these people. Joshua spoke this morning, Yang Yang's a recent postdoc, and then Douglas, Sylvia, and Laura Thompson, who's in the audience, has got a poster, Mike Heather at Strathclyde University. So I'll talk about FISHSPAMMS and why it's called Fish Spillover Production and Aggregation from Man-Made Marine Structures. That was the original name. I'll talk a little bit about the technology we've been using to monitor fish, which is largely sonar methods, and Josh has already spoken about the USV, so I won't talk about that. And then I'll talk about how we've been monitoring the effects of partly decommissioned oil and gas platforms. We also visited Hutton and Miller, a variety of oil and gas platforms, and then I'll also touch on wind farms. And finally, I'll talk about the implications for fisheries. So we know that artificial marine structures attract fish, and in some places, such as California, they attract a lot of fish, creating a lot of production. And that's led to a variety of initiatives around the world known as rigs to reefs, particularly in the United States, but also in Australia and Thailand, where some of our audience work, notably from Chevron. And prior evidence suggests that the density of fish is quite localized. So when you look at the distance from the structure, with the on the left-hand side would be at the structure location as a function of density. Generally, fish are variable in terms of the location. They depend on a lot of factors: the depth, the substrate, and various other factors. But when you see a structure, you get these localized, very high densities of fish, and that's evident from a lot of ROV footage in the North Sea, and lots of studies, as I said, done in California and other places. And that's been described as a halo effect or a horizontal range of influence. And it's a positive one because as you get closer to the structure, in this case, the densities are higher, the abundances are higher. And this has been observed in various places, not least the Gulf of Mexico and the North Sea, but it's generally thought to be low in terms of the range of influence, i.e. the distances over which you get these higher elevations are small. And that's largely due to the methods that have been used to detect them, because they've been based on ROV studies, which necessarily are localized, and other visual methods which have a very limited range. Here's an example of a negative range of influence. And this is from the FISHSPAMMS publication that was spoken about earlier. And in this case, you have a negative range of influence because as you get closer to the structure, there's, in this case, benthic abundance is lower, and that's due to a pollution effect. So you can get these negative ranges of influence, which we've seen, but in our case, in terms of fish, we're talking about a positive range of influence. And the interesting thing about spillover is that you can get a perceived longer horizontal range of influence where the structure, the number of fish from that structure spill out into a larger area. And there's two reasons for this spillover. One, you might get aggregation of animals coming from the wider area towards the structure. And two, you might be getting production away from the structure and spilling out into the adjacent area. And so this spillover effect might be greater than what you might consider to be the immediate adjacent area of the structure. And so what we've been doing is taking high-resolution data to have a look at this sort of phenomenon. And this is what's called an echogram. This is the kind of currency that we work on from our sonar data. On the left-hand side, you have the depth, and on the x-axis, you have the distance. In this case, it's distance from the structure. And you can see the structure here. This is the Hutton platform. This is the green line, indicates the difference between the water column and the seabed. The colours are indicative of the backscatter, and it's a classical echogram colour scheme where the darker, warmer colours are higher intensity objects which scatter sound. So the seabed has a very dark structure, plankton and light structure, blue and green colours, and then fish schools, as you can see on top of here, on top of the structure, form very strong scattering because they've got air-filled swim bladders. And then you can see individual fish also located around the structure. This is the Hutton platform that is now semi-decommissioned, but is quite a significant structure. As you can see, it's about 20 meters in height and about 80 by 40 meters in horizontal and vertical extent. We can do some signal processing to try and isolate some of the types of fish that we're interested in. And the first thing we can do is look at the schooling fish, and once we take out all these other scatterers of plankton and individual fish, you end up with this schooling fish echogram, and we can quantify this and produce actual numbers of density in absolute quantities. And then you can do the reverse and screen the schooling fish and take out the plankton and do some signal processing to work out where the individual fish are who don't school. And these would be your gadoids like hake, haddock, cod, saithe, and whiting, which are common commercial species in the North Sea. And each of these individual dots is an individual fish that's been detected, and the colour code is an indication of the strength of that scattering from that fish, which is proportional to the size of the fish. So we can size these fish as well. Now here are some interesting echograms from the Miller structure as opposed to the Hutton one that you just saw, and it gives you an idea of the variability that you see over time in the structures of fish schools over the structure that you see here highlighted in green again, which is the Miller platform, slightly shallower, about 100 meters in this case. But this beautiful mushroom cloud here is one of my favorite echograms, and that's a big herring school that's accumulated over the top of this structure, right on top of it. This was taken on the 25th of June at about 2:30, and you came back on the next day and passed over the structure again. And one of the advantages of this technique, of course, is this is from a ship. This is from the Scotia. This is Sally Rouse's Hutton and Miller cruise that a lot of us have been working on. You can go straight over the top of these structures. And you can see in this case, the day later, the fish school wasn't on top of it. It was much more reduced. It was just off to the side there. We came back a week later. This is now the 30th of June, and the fish school was now sat on top of the structure again. And then over the course of the next few hours, doing multiple passes over this structure, we were able to see different formations and different abundances of the school as they sort of moved around it. So these are the sequences separated by about half an hour. And you can see another school breaking off and very intense parts of the school forming on different sides of the structure. If you put all of that data together and you have that same picture looking at the horizontal range of influence for the Miller on the left and Hutton on the right, you can see that you have elevated fish densities close to the structure. And if you fit a segmented regression through the data, the very fine resolution data points that we have with multiple passes over the area and adjacent to it up to about 5,000 meters in this case, you can see that the horizontal range of influence for Miller was about 354 meters, and that of Hutton was around 628 meters. And this was for schooling fish, the types of clustered schooling fish that you saw in those echograms. You can do the same for individual fish, and you get quite similar results, peculiarly, about 356 for Miller and 600 for Hutton. And this is a completely different metric now. This is mutually exclusive fish density. This is the cod, haddock, and whiting, as opposed to the herring and sprat that you saw in the schooling fish. So that was the sort of partially decommissioned structures. We did a survey back in 2012, which prompted this whole initiative, actually, in terms of us applying for the Insight funding. In 2012, we took advantage of acoustic data that was collected during a trawl survey, and they were able to go close to platforms, but not within the 500-meter exclusion zone. So we have a slightly different analysis, but we're looking at distances from structure now of many kilometers, because this was over the range of the entire North Sea. And we visited 16 oil and gas platforms, or close to 16 oil and gas platforms, and we compared our fish densities to a background fish density. So this was the question that Josh was asking before, because we laboured a little bit about what a background fish density, a baseline would be. In this case, it's 25 kilometres or more away from an oil and gas platform, in the same type of substrate, because we can measure the substrate characteristics with our sonar, at the same latitude, plus or minus half a degree, I think, and is that it? Same depth, yes, plus or minus 10 meters. Yeah. And you can see that the background fish density was slightly lower than the ones very close to the structures. And there were 16 of these types of plots in the paper that's just been produced, actually, in PLOS One. And overall, there was an average horizontal range of influence of about 7 kilometers. Some were less, and some were greater. So at that sort of scale, you can't really consider just one structure. You have to really consider the network, because if you've got a horizontal range of influence that's the order of kilometers, what happens when that overlaps? You really do have to think about the network. And you'll see that uptick in one of those HRIs I showed you before, and that's because further along, at larger distances, you're beginning to get the influence of another structure that might be close by. So you have to think of it not in terms of a distance to structure, but in terms of platform density. And so we sort of configured in this paper the fish school presence and the individual fish density as a function of platform density rather than distance. And in that case, the more platforms there are per kilometre, then the higher the fish densities in both of these cases. We did that sort of analysis for our USV survey. So this is the USV that we used, and this is a track anonymized so that you don't know which oil and gas platforms we're dealing with. But it also went through a wind farm. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we went through 5 of these structures, and we got similar kind of results where as more platforms per unit area, higher the fish density in both the fish schools and the fish density. There's some indication that platform size has an effect. It's a little bit more difficult to try and tease that out because getting statistics on all the types of platforms in a consistent manner is quite difficult. But obviously the type of structure are very different. A concrete structure will be much heavier than a metal jacket. So for the same type of structure like a metal jacket, then we saw that there was a size effect of platform. The other thing that we've started to look at is fish size. So these are similar kind of figures now, but on the y-axis now, rather than density, we've got the length of fish in centimetres, so 20, 40, 60 centimetres. And we found that close to the structures, you get larger fish. Now that isn't itself evidence of production, but it's consistent with production because you'd expect larger fish to be the more mature ones and the ones that are likely to be producing. So there's some evidence for production close to these structures. But that question is really going to be answered by my colleagues at Strathclyde. And if you go outside, there's a poster by Laura Thompson and others explaining our modelling to try and answer these. And the link between the modelling and the empirical data is that what we have is a population model of fish. In this case, this is saithe in the North Sea. And it's been devised at a grid cell size that when we include the structures, which are these grey points, the horizontal range of influence of those structures is derived from our empirical data. So in this case, it's an average of around 7 kilometres. Because if you took them as just individual points, then they wouldn't amount to very much in terms of their area. But as 7-kilometre radiuses, they suddenly stomach a bit more significant. And that was my answer to your question, Chris, as to what sort of size you might consider. And in these two cases here, in the middle you have a low effect of these structures in terms of their aggregation and production, and in this case you might have a higher productive effect. And if you read the poster, you'll see some of the results and the methods that have been used for this modelling, which is now ongoing. And once we've got this model set up, which we now have, Laura can start conducting these experiments to determine the effect of these structures and the effect of production. And then we can validate those according to comparisons, spatial comparisons with trawl survey data to find out which fits best. So I just want to finally talk about wind farms, because if you think about the odd oil and gas platform being a network, well, when you've got wind farms, that's a network in spades. And so we've already been through one offshore wind farm, and Josh showed you this picture before of our USV going through it. And these are some of the preliminary results that we found in that our schooling fish and our individual fish, we found much higher densities inside rather than outside the wind farm. And we'll be looking at this now in terms of size. And if you go outside, Ross Rutherford, my PhD student, who's also in the audience, he's got a poster which describes some of the size differences there as well. And I just want to finish now to talk about implications for fisheries. So this map on the right-hand side is a map produced by a consultancy for the Scottish Fishermen's Federation, talking about the spatial squeeze on fisheries. We've seen now how marine space is increasingly being used for a variety of activities, not only the oil and gas, which are these red dots, but the wind farms in blue and the protected areas in green, and the pipelines in the dark green lights. So these areas exclude fishers, at least fishers with mobile gear. And so operationally, artificial marine structures are driving fishing out of these areas. And then in terms of regulation, marine protected areas are also increasingly driving them out because we don't want fishing to occur inside these protected areas for good reasons. And so you have these loss of traditional areas to fishing. You have increased competition in the space that's left. And then you have to add in the changes to the fish distribution that may be likely. So almost conversely, these artificial marine structures seem to be aggregating fish. They're fish aggregating devices. And so we could be seeing that fish are moving into these structures and into these networks. Although if they're also producing, you might find that they spill out from those networks. And so what you might get is the spillover and opportunities for fishermen to target spillovers along the edge. And this is quite a common phenomenon, actually, in marine protected areas globally, particularly in the tropics. Some implications for scientific monitoring of these fish stocks as well, because survey boats are going to be excluded from these areas. You won't be able to trawl inside protected areas. We haven't done that for a long time already at Rockall in Lophalia protected areas. And that's going to be the case for areas around wind farms. So we're going to have to come up with new methods to deal with that. And then we'll also have to think about the stratification, the statistical properties of dealing with these hotspots, these horizontal ranges of influence. Because if these fish schools are stuck on top of these structures for a large part of the time, we want to make sure that we survey them adequately. So, just to conclude, FISHSPAMMS has found evidence of spillover. It's not just a localized effect that we find these fish concentrations. They have a longer horizontal range of influence, certainly than has been measured before, of the order of hundreds of meters for those partly decommissioned structures, and of the order of kilometers for some of these platforms. There may be some indication that the density is related to structure density, but also related to structure size. We've got effective technology, not only in terms of our platforms, but also in terms of our tools, which are effective for monitoring schools and individual fish. But the implications for fisheries in relation to this spatial squeeze is that there is a bit of a trade-off between this aggregation, production, spillover that we haven't quite determined the extent of, but hopefully our modelling studies will give us some indication of what that is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And we're on to our final speaker for this session. We welcome Anaël Lemasson from the University of Plymouth, who'll be talking about how we turn dreams into reality. Just this one. And just stand a little bit to the side if you want.
Okay, yeah. Hi, sorry, I'm Anaël. I'm a postdoc at the University of Plymouth, and I was working on the DREAMS project, which was led by the University of Plymouth, PML, and CFAS. And today I'll just be giving you an overview of what the project was about and some of the findings that we have. First, I just wanted to have a little thought for Paul Summerfield, who was the overall PI for DREAMS and the synthesis. Most of you in the room have know Paul or have been involved in the synthesis, and as you know, he sadly passed away last year. So first, DREAMS stands for Decommissioning Relative Effects of Alternative Management Strategies. The overall aim was to build a reliable and robust evidence base to support the decision-making process around the management of offshore structures, in particular oil and gas and offshore wind farm in the North Sea, and to develop a system to show the different effects of implementing different decommissioning strategies. The project had essentially 4 work packages. The first work package was aimed at building the evidence base by creating a coded database or a catalogue of scientific research, if you want. The second work package aimed at using that evidence base and reviewing and analysing the data and information within it, relating to the ecosystem effects of the structures. We then had a work package incorporating that evidence into ecosystem biogeochemical models at the North Sea scale. And finally, we had a work package that sort of worked across the other work packages about sharing the outcomes and delivering wider impact. I will start with the first work package. I was directly involved in this one. As I mentioned, it's essentially creating an evidence base, a coded database of the research. We used a systematic evidence synthesis approach called a systematic map. To do that, we trawled through the peer-reviewed scientific literature using set methodologies. We scanned through over 20,000 articles, and in the end retained just shy of 1,000 papers that we coded into that database. That all sort of answered the question of what published evidence exists for the effects of the structures while in place and after decommissioning on various components of the marine ecosystem. The database and the report have been published and is fully available online for everyone to use if you may wish to do so. Briefly, some of the key messages and findings from that systematic map is that we actually had very few decommissioning studies. By that we mean real-world sort of case studies of decommissioning structures. We only found 57 articles, which was in contrast with the sheer number of papers relating to the effect of structures while let's see, the presence effect. So we couldn't use the decommissioning case studies in work package 2 as we wanted to do initially, and decided instead to infer the decommissioning effects by looking at the presence effects and see what we would lose or retain depending on which decommissioning options we would be using. Those are only two of the multiple heat maps that we created as part of the systematic map. What it does is it shows you the knowledge clusters and the knowledge gaps based on that database of nearly 1,000 studies. In blue and green as your knowledge clusters, and you can see, for example, that we know a lot about purpose-built artificial reefs, especially relating to ecological or community outcomes or species or biological outcomes. We know a lot less on more recent structures such as marine renewable energy installation. We also know a lot when we dug down to sort of population level what those studies were investigating. We see that we know a lot about fish and about invertebrates. They've been quite clearly well studied, but we know a lot less about things like bird, mammals, plankton, or microbes. So moving on to work package 2, this was split into two different parts. One that did a review of the ecosystem services relating to offshore wind, and another one on which was a meta-analysis of the ecological effects of offshore structures. The ecosystem service, I will only briefly talk to you about it because Steve, who is here, will be giving you a more in-depth talk in the next session. So essentially, part of the work was a global literature review of the effects of offshore wind farms on key ecosystem services, and this was based on that work package 1 database of studies. And there was also a second part which looked at the effect of decommissioning oil and gas and shipwrecks on ecosystem services, but this has not yet been published. Some of the key findings was that essentially, even though there's a considerable amount of research, I need to hurry up, on the ecology of marine artificial structures, there's very large gaps remaining in our understanding of the linkages and interaction with ecosystem services in society. And as you can see from this diagram, which is equivalent of a heat map as well, I suppose, that some ecosystem services were enhanced by the presence of offshore wind farm, and others were negatively impacted. But like I said, Steve will go into more detail about this. The second part was a meta-analysis of ecological effects of offshore structures. What we did, we used the knowledge clusters identified in the first work package and ask a series of questions relating to the effect of the structures on fish and invertebrates especially. Won't go into details into the methods, but we scanned through that database of research and ended up selecting 109 articles, which provided us with 531 effect sizes. So this is a global meta-analysis. We run those data and through multiple meta-analytical models. And I will briefly talk through some of the results. So on the left is, these are orchard plots. They're essentially a type of forest plots. And they show you whether the structure had an impact on the ecological outcome or whatever it was that we put into the models. Here on the left, we compared sites with structures to natural sedimentary sites. And what we can see is that offshore wind farm had no significant effect on these are all the ecological outcomes combined, pooled. Oil and gas had some moderate positive impact, and so potentially there is additional benefits of oil and gas, and they could act as oases in the desert. On the right-hand side is essentially the same style of analysis, but these are all the studies that compare the structures to natural reefs. And I will go into a bit more detail later about this, but as you can see, there was very few studies for oil and gas and offshore wind farm, but what we can tell in purple are your purpose-built artificial reefs, and there was no significant difference between the ecological outcomes identified at a purpose-built artificial reef to a natural reef, which is it's a good thing in this instance. It means they act as we want them to act as artificial reefs. So this is the same plot as before, but instead of pulling all the different ecological outcomes, they were split, so abundance, biomass, and diversity. And focusing just on the offshore wind farm and oil and gas, what we can take is actually if we consider an oasis in the desert as being a diversity, like enhancing diversity, they don't serve that purpose, and only purpose-built artificial reef seems to be boosting diversity when compared to natural sedimentary habitats. The bottom part is, again, the same comparisons, but comparing them to natural reefs. And the main message that I want you to take from this is that we actually found very few studies that compare those offshore structures to natural rocky reef habitats. And this limited our assessment of their ecological effects and prevented us from drawing any sort of conclusions on whether they actually could act as de facto artificial reefs. So in theory, if oil and gas and offshore wind farm acted as artificial reefs, decommissioning them in the sea, for instance, by toppling them or reefing them or whatnot, could assist us in reaching ecological conservation targets and achieve environmental net gains. But here we've actually found no evidence to support this common assumption, but only limited ecological benefits if we compare them to natural sedimentary habitats. So some final points about this second work package is that there were clear research and evidence gaps which limited our analysis and interpretation. And some of that evidence dates from the searches in 2021. So potentially are already out of date. There's been, as you all know, a clear research effort towards understanding this sort of things. And ultimately, ideally, we'd like more direct evidence from decommissioning case studies, which is a point that we've made in an opinion piece in TREE last year. The third work package was the modelling work package. And again, I'm just going to give an overview because there will be talks in the next session by Molly, who will go into more details in some of those aspects. The first part of the work package 3 aimed to model the epiphenol growth associated with the structures using the FBCOM-SM biogeochemical ecological model and applying it to a range of decommissioning options. What they show is that the effect of offshore oil and gas structures on the primary productivity and biogeochemical fluxes was spatially limited and practically negligible at the scale of the model resolution they used. And this was in contrast with the effect of offshore wind farms, where placement density is much higher, leading to detectable impacts on primary productivity and chlorophyll production. The second part of work package 3 aimed to identify connectivity hotspots in the North Sea and using a combination of, sorry, I'm reading it from the side, I do apologize, high-resolution hydrodynamic modeling, biogeochemical modeling, particle tracking, and a graph network analysis. They generated a spatial connectivity importance index under a novel Everything is Everywhere framework. And what this provided was a generic overview of maximum potential connectivity in the North Sea. Hopefully I've mentioned that right. But Molly will go over this with you this afternoon in the next session. Finally, the work package 4 was sharing the outcomes and delivering impact. And very briefly, those are some of the outputs that we've had. From the first work package, we've had the protocol published, which lays out the different methodology and the aims of that work package. The report and the database have been published, and as I mentioned, is freely available for you to use as well. We have a plain language summary for policymakers that have been published and is supported by the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, and an opinion piece in TREE, which sort of lists the challenges of evidence-informed decommissioning. The second work package has 2 different publications that review of the effect of offshore wind farm on ecosystem services and the meta-analysis of ecological effect of offshore marine artificial structures. We have 2 manuscripts in prep for work package 3, which hopefully will be out by the end of the year. And there's been wider sort of engagement and impact work, both to date and ongoing and planned for the future. We've had several presentations at the different iterations of SIMEs, as well as the Insight webinars, presentations with to OSPA, various press releases, a radio interview, a policy brief, which I have outside if anybody is interested, and a couple of videos. We have one that's being launched today. The QR code is in the poster outside if you would like to watch the video about the whole DREAMS project in general. So that's it from me. Thank you.